The gunshot that tore through the saloon window missed Buck Lawson by inches, but it was enough to make him decide that drinking in Ash Fork, Arizona territory on this particular Saturday night wasn't worth losing his head over. He tossed a coin on the bar, grabbed his hat, and slipped out the back door while the other patrons dove for cover and returned fire at whoever was causing trouble in the street. The year was 1878, and violence was as common as dust in this part of the territory, but Buck had seen enough bloodshed to last him several lifetimes. He'd come to Ash Fork looking for work, not trouble, and the cattle drive he'd signed on for wasn't set to leave until Monday morning anyway. The night air hit him like a cool blessing after the stale tobacco smoke and whiskey fumes inside. Buck untied his horse from the rail and led the mare away from the noise, deciding to ride out a ways and make camp under the stars rather than pay for a lumpy mattress in a boarding house that would probably get shot up before dawn anyway. The moon hung fat and bright overhead, casting long shadows across the high desert landscape as he rode north, following an old wagon trail until the sounds of Ash Fork faded to nothing but memory and cricket song. He found a good spot near a cluster of juniper trees where a small spring created a pool of water that reflected the stars like scattered diamonds. Buck unsaddled his horse, hobbled her near the water, and was gathering wood for a fire when he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. About 20 yards away, beneath an ancient cottonwood tree, lay what appeared to be a person wrapped in a thin blanket, completely still. Buck's hand went instinctively to the revolver at his hip as he approached cautiously. In this territory, stumbling across a body wasn't uncommon, and more often than not, it meant trouble either had just happened or was about to. But as he drew closer, he could see the gentle rise and fall of breathing, and the figure was too small to be a man. He knelt down carefully, keeping his distance but close enough to see clearly in the moonlight. It was a young woman, her dark hair spread across the ground like spilled ink, her face peaceful in sleep, despite having nothing but hard earth for a mattress and the vast Arizona sky for a roof. Her dress was worn and dusty, the kind of simple cotton garment that working women wore, and she had no shoes on her feet. A small bundle that might have contained her worldly possessions sat near her head. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23 years old, and Buck found himself wondering what circumstances would lead a woman to be sleeping alone in the wilderness with no protection, no horse, and apparently no destination. He backed away quietly, not wanting to startle her, and returned to his own campsite where he built a small fire and put coffee on to boil. The protective instinct that rose in him was something he couldn't quite explain, but he positioned himself between her and the open trail, figuring that if trouble came in the night, he'd be the first line of defense whether she knew it or not. Dawn came with the soft pink and gold light that made the desert beautiful despite its harshness. Buck was awake before the sun, as was his habit, and he glanced over to where the young woman had been sleeping. She was sitting up now, stretching like someone who'd just woken from a long journey, and when she turned her head and saw him, she didn't scream or run. Instead, she simply watched him with large, dark eyes that held a wariness he recognized in wild animals that had been hurt before. "Morning," Buck called out, keeping his voice gentle and his hands visible. "I've got coffee if you want some. I'm not looking to cause you any trouble." She stood slowly, wrapping the thin blanket around her shoulders, and after a long moment of consideration, she picked up her small bundle and walked toward his camp. Up close, Buck could see she was beautiful in an unconventional way, with strong features and sun-darkened skin that spoke of native heritage mixed with something else. Her eyes were the color of good whiskey, amber and warm, but filled with a sadness that seemed older than her years. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice slightly hoarse. She sat on a rock near the fire but kept enough distance that she could run if needed. Buck poured coffee into his spare tin cup and handed it to her, then busied himself with frying bacon and hardtack in his skillet, figuring she probably hadn't eaten in a while. They sat in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the crackling fire and the morning birds starting their songs. Finally, Buck cleared his throat. "Name's Buck Lawson. I'm heading back to Ash Fork in a bit, then moving cattle up toward Flagstaff come Monday. You got people around here? Somewhere you're trying to get to?" The young woman wrapped both hands around the cup like she was trying to absorb its warmth into her bones. "Zara," she said simply. "Zara Ashford. And no, I don't have people. Not anymore." Buck divided the food between 2 tin plates and handed her one. She took it with a grateful nod and ate slowly, like someone who'd learned to make small portions last. He wanted to ask questions, but something told him to wait, to let her offer information in her own time. After she'd finished eating, Zara looked out at the vast expanse of desert and mountains that stretched in every direction. "I was sleeping under the stars because I didn't have anywhere else to go," she said quietly. "The family I was working for in Prescott, they lost everything in a fire. Couldn't afford to keep me on, couldn't pay me what they owed. So I walked. Been walking for days, sleeping wherever night catches me." "That's dangerous for a woman alone," Buck said, though he kept any judgment out of his voice. He wasn't criticizing, just stating a fact they both knew. "Everything's dangerous when you've got nothing and nobody," Zara replied. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Buck felt something shift in his chest at the expression in her eyes. "I dream of a place to belong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Somewhere I'm not just hired help or a burden or something to be used up and cast aside. Just a place where I matter, you know. Where I'm home." The raw honesty in her words hit Buck harder than he expected. He'd been drifting for years himself, moving from job to job, town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. He told himself he liked the freedom, but in the quiet moments, he knew he was just as lost as she seemed to be. "I understand that," he said finally. "More than you might think." He poured more coffee for both of them. "Look, Ash Fork's not much, but there's work there sometimes. The boarding house owner, Mrs. Chen, she's always looking for help. And the cattle outfit I'm working for, they've got a ranch up north. Might be they need a cook or someone to help with the house. I could put in a word for you." Zara's eyes widened slightly. "You do that? For a stranger?" "Nobody should have to sleep alone in the desert with no protection," Buck said simply. "And you seem like decent folk. Besides, something tells me you're a hard worker when given the chance." She smiled then, and it transformed her whole face. "I work harder than any 2 people. I cook, I clean, I can sew, mend fences, tend animals. I grew up on a ranch before." She trailed off, the smile fading. "Before everything fell apart." Buck didn't push for details. Everyone out here had a story, and most of them were tinged with loss. "Well then, if you want, you can ride back to Ash Fork with me. We'll see what we can find. At the very least, we'll get you fed proper and somewhere safe to sleep that's not the hard ground." The gratitude in Zara's eyes was almost painful to see. "I'd appreciate that more than you know," she said. "I promise I'm not looking for charity. I'll work for whatever help you give me." "Fair enough," Buck said. He started breaking down his camp, and Zara immediately began helping, working with the easy efficiency of someone who'd done such tasks 1,000 times. They moved well together, he noticed, an unspoken coordination that felt natural despite having just met. The ride back to Ash Fork took a few hours, with Zara sitting behind Buck on his mare. She held onto his waist lightly at first, almost reluctant to touch him. But as the horse picked up speed, she gripped tighter, and Buck found himself very aware of her presence behind him. They talked some during the ride, small bits of information exchanged between long, comfortable silences. He learned she was 22, that her mother had been Apache and her father a ranch hand from Texas who died when she was young. She'd been passed around between relatives and employers most of her life, never quite fitting in anywhere, always feeling like an outsider. Buck shared some of his own story in turn. He was 28, originally from Oklahoma before it was called that, raised on a small farm that had failed during a drought. He'd been working cattle drives and ranch jobs since he was 16, moving from place to place, good with horses and decent with a rope, but never finding a reason to settle. His parents were gone. A sister married off to a shopkeeper in Kansas City, and he had a restlessness in his blood that made staying in one place feel like suffocation. "Maybe that's what people like us are supposed to do," Zara said thoughtfully as Ash Fork came into view. "Just keep moving until we run out of west to go to." "Maybe," Buck agreed. "Or maybe we just haven't found the right reason to stop yet." Ash Fork looked slightly less chaotic in the daylight, though there were still signs of the previous night's violence in the form of broken glass and a few bloodstains in the street that someone would eventually throw dirt over. Buck led Zara to Mrs. Chen's boarding house, a sturdy adobe building at the edge of town that had survived more rowdiness than most places twice its size. Mrs. Chen was a formidable Chinese woman in her 50s who'd come west with her husband during the railroad construction and stayed after he died of fever. She ran the cleanest establishment in town and had a sharp eye for character. When Buck explained Zara's situation, leaving out the part about finding her sleeping in the desert because that might raise questions about propriety, Mrs. Chen looked Zara up and down with an appraising gaze. "You know how to wash sheets without tearing them?" she asked bluntly. "How to cook for 20 men without burning everything? How to keep drunk cowboys from destroying my furniture?" Yes, madam, and I'll do my best on that last one," Zara said, meeting the older woman's eyes steadily. Mrs. Chen's stern expression cracked slightly. "You've got spine, I'll give you that. All right, I'll try you out for a week. Room and board plus $1 a day if you work out. If you don't, you leave peacefully, no fuss." "Deal, Zara said quickly, relief flooding her features. She turned to Buck. "Thank you, truly, I won't forget this kindness." Buck touched the brim of his hat. "Just be good to yourself," he said. "You deserve better than sleeping under stars with no safety." He left them to work out the details, feeling oddly reluctant to go. The rest of that day and all of Sunday, Buck found himself thinking about Zara more than he should. He kept making excuses to walk past the boarding house, telling himself he was just checking to make sure she was settling in all right, though he never actually went inside. He saw her once through the window, her arms full of linens, laughing at something Mrs. Chen said, and the sight made something warm settle in his chest. Monday morning came cold and clear, perfect weather for driving cattle. Buck met the rest of the crew at the stockyards where 500 head of cattle waited to be moved north to the ranch outside Flagstaff. The trail boss was a grizzled man named Dutch McCarty, who'd been working cattle since before Buck was born. The crew consisted of 8 other cowboys, all experienced, all hard men who knew their business. "All right, listen up," Dutch called out as they mounted their horses. "We've got a 3-week drive ahead of us if weather holds and nothing spooks the herd. The ranch we're headed to is the Broken Arrow, owned by a man named Josiah Cartwright. Good man, pays fair, and he's got a standing operation up there with a house, bunkhouse, and facilities. Some of you might get offered full-time work if you prove yourselves." Keep the cattle moving, keep them calm, and nobody dies. Got it. The men nodded and began the long process of getting the cattle moving. Buck took his position on the left flank, working his horse back and forth to keep the stragglers in line. It was good, hard work that required focus, which was exactly what he needed to keep his mind from wandering back to a young woman with amber eyes and a dream of belonging somewhere. They made good progress that first day, covering nearly 12 miles before making camp. As Buck sat by the campfire that night eating beans and salt pork, one of the other cowboys, a young man named Pete, started talking about the Broken Arrow Ranch. "I worked there one season a few years back," Pete said. "It's a beautiful spread, right up in the high country where there's actual grass and trees. Old man Cartwright built it up from nothing. He's getting on in years now, though. Heard he's looking to hire permanent help because he can't run it all himself anymore. Got no kids of his own to pass it to." Buck listened with growing interest. A permanent position on a good ranch wasn't something to dismiss lightly. He'd been drifting long enough. Maybe it was time to think about settling, about building something that lasted longer than the next cattle drive or temporary job. The 3 weeks on the trail passed with the usual mix of monotony and occasional excitement. They lost 2 steers to a mountain lion, spent one terrifying night keeping the herd calm during a thunderstorm, and dealt with a group of young men who thought about rustling cattle until they saw how many armed cowboys were guarding them. Through it all, Buck found his thoughts returning to Zara with surprising frequency. He wondered how she was doing at the boarding house, whether Mrs. Chen was treating her fairly, whether she was safe. It bothered him how much he thought about her. He barely knew the woman, had spent maybe a few hours in her company total, yet she'd taken up residence in his mind like she belonged there. He remembered the way she'd looked sleeping under the stars, peaceful despite having nothing. He remembered her honesty, the raw vulnerability in her voice when she'd said she dreamed of belonging somewhere. He remembered the brief warmth of her arms around his waist during the ride to Ash Fork, and the sound of her laugh through the boarding house window. The Broken Arrow Ranch exceeded Buck's expectations. Nestled in a high valley with the San Francisco peaks visible in the distance, it had good water, thick grass, and enough timber for building and firewood. The main house was a solid log structure with a wide porch, and the outbuildings were well maintained. Josiah Cartwright was a tall man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and sharp blue eyes that still held plenty of intelligence and fire. "You men did good work getting my cattle here safe," Josiah said after they'd gotten the animals settled into the holding pens. "I'll pay you what Dutch promised, plus a bonus for the ones you didn't lose. And I'll say this now, I'm looking for 4 good men to hire on permanent. Year-round work, decent pay, percentage of profits if we do well. I need men who know cattle can work through winter and aren't going to run off at the first sign of hard work. Any interested parties, come talk to me tomorrow after you've rested." That night, Buck barely slept. A permanent job on a ranch this good was an opportunity he'd be foolish to pass up. But more than that, the Broken Arrow was close enough to Ash Fork that he could ride there on a day off, which meant he could check on Zara, make sure she was doing all right. The thought of seeing her again made his heart beat faster in a way that had nothing to do with the job opportunity. Morning came, and Buck was one of 5 cowboys who approached Josiah about the permanent positions. The rancher interviewed each man separately, asking about experience, skills, and what they were looking for in a job. When it was Buck's turn, he answered honestly about his years of work, his way with horses, and his belief that it was time to stop drifting and build something lasting. "You've got good references," Josiah said, leaning back in his chair. Dutch speaks highly of you, says you're steady and reliable, says you kept your head during that storm when some of the younger men panicked. I like that. I'm offering you 40 a month plus room and board, and if we have a good year, a share of the profits. You'll work cattle, help with any building or repairs that need doing, and in winter, you'll help keep stock alive through the cold months. It's hard work, but it's honest work on a good piece of land. What do you say? Buck didn't hesitate. I say yes, sir. When do I start? You already have, Josiah said with a smile, shaking his hand firmly. Welcome to the Broken Arrow. Buck settled into ranch life with an ease that surprised him. The 3 other men Josiah hired were solid workers, and they quickly developed a good rhythm. The days were long and filled with the endless tasks that come with running a cattle operation, but Buck found satisfaction in the work that he hadn't felt in years. This was building towards something, not just passing through. But as the days turned into a week, then 2, Buck couldn't shake the feeling that something was incomplete. He thought about Zara constantly, wondered how she was doing, whether she was still at the boarding house or had moved on to something else. Finally, after 3 weeks at the Broken Arrow, Buck asked Josiah if he could have a day off to ride into Ash Fork. Got business in town? Josiah asked with a knowing look. Something like that, Buck admitted. The older man smiled. Take 2 days, you've earned it. Just be back for the gather on Thursday. Buck rode out before dawn, pushing his mare faster than he probably should have, eager to reach Ash Fork. The trip took most of the day, and by the time he arrived, the sun was setting and the town was starting to liven up with its usual evening chaos. He went straight to Mrs. Chen's boarding house, his heart pounding in a way that felt foolish but inevitable. Mrs. Chen answered his knock with a surprised expression. Buck Lawson. Didn't expect to see you back so soon. Thought you were moving cattle north. We did. I got hired on permanent at the Broken Arrow, Buck said, trying to peer past her into the house. I was wondering how Miss Ashford is doing. She's still working for you. Mrs. Chen's expression softened. That girl's a treasure. Works twice as hard as she needs to, never complains, and the boarders actually behave better when she's around. I don't know how she does it, but even the roughest cowboys mind their manners when she serves them dinner. Relief flooded through Buck. That's good to hear. Is she here? I'd like to speak with her if that's all right. She's in the kitchen finishing up the evening dishes, Mrs. Chen said, stepping aside. Go on back, but Buck, that girl's had a hard life. Don't go breaking her heart just because you're feeling lonely after 3 weeks on the trail. No, madam, Buck said seriously. That's not my intention at all. He found Zara at a large sink, her hands in soapy water, scrubbing a pot. She was humming softly to herself, a tune he didn't recognize, and she looked so peaceful in the lamplight that he almost hated to interrupt. But then she turned and saw him, and the way her face lit up made his breath catch. Buck, she said, surprise and pleasure mixing in her voice. I didn't know you were back. Just got in, he said, suddenly feeling awkward like a boy instead of a man nearly 30 years old. I wanted to see how you were doing, make sure everything was working out all right. Zara dried her hands on her apron, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. It's working out better than all right. Mrs. Chen's been wonderful and the work keeps me busy. I've even managed to save almost every penny she's paid me. I'm building towards something, you know. Maybe eventually I'll have enough to rent a little place of my own or find a better situation. That's good, Buck said. Real good. You deserve good things, Zara. They stood looking at each other for a long moment, an awareness building between them that felt both comfortable and charged with possibility. Finally, Zara broke the silence. Did you come all the way from the ranch just to check on me? Maybe I did, Buck admitted. Is that so strange? A little, Zara said softly. Most people, once they've done their good deed, they move on. They don't come back. I'm not most people, Buck said. And I can't seem to stop thinking about you if I'm being honest. Ever since I found you sleeping under those stars, you've been in my head. The way you looked so peaceful despite having nothing. The way you said you dreamed of belonging somewhere. I understand that dream, Zara. I've been looking for the same thing most of my life. Zara's eyes shimmered in the lamplight. What are you saying, Buck? He stepped closer, his hat in his hands. I'm saying I'd like to court you proper if you're willing. I know we've only just met, and I know I'm just a cowboy working another man's ranch, but I've got steady work now, and I can offer you respect and honesty. And maybe, given time, we could both find that place to belong that we've been looking for, together. The hope that bloomed in Zara's expression was beautiful to see. I'd like that, she said quietly. I'd like that very much. Buck stayed in Ash Fork that night and all the next day, spending every free moment with Zara when she wasn't working. They walked around the town, talking about everything and nothing. She told him more about her childhood, the pain of being caught between two cultures, never fully accepted by either her mother's Apache relatives or her father's white community. She'd learned to keep her head down, to work hard, to expect little and hope for less. Buck shared his own struggles, the endless moving, the sense of never quite fitting anywhere, the loneliness that came from having no real connections. They discovered they both loved storms, both preferred coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, both had a tendency to wake before dawn no matter how late they stayed up. When Buck kissed her goodbye before riding back to the ranch, it was gentle and sweet, full of promise rather than demand. Zara's hand lingered in his, and when she looked up at him, her eyes held something that might have been the beginning of love. "Come back when you can," she said softly. "Count on it," Buck promised. The next few months fell into a pattern that made Buck happier than he'd been in years. He worked hard at the Broken Arrow during the week, learning every aspect of the ranch operation, proving himself invaluable to Josiah. The older man clearly appreciated having reliable help, and he gradually gave Buck more responsibility, trusting him to make decisions and handle problems independently. Every 2 weeks, Buck would ride to Ash Fork to see Zara. Sometimes he could only stay a few hours, but other times Josiah would give him a full day off and he'd stay overnight at the boarding house in one of the guest rooms, keeping things proper and respectable. He and Zara would walk, talk, share meals, and slowly, carefully, build something real between them. Zara bloomed under the attention and security. The haunted wariness that had filled her eyes when Buck first found her gradually faded, replaced by confidence and joy. Mrs. Chen reported that Zara was the best help she'd ever had, and several boarders asked if Zara would consider working for them instead, offering higher wages. But Zara turned them all down, saying she was happy where she was. "The truth is," she told Buck during one of his visits, "I'm happy where you are. I don't want to move farther away and see you less." They were sitting on the porch of the boarding house, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of orange and purple. Buck reached over and took her hand, marveling as he always did at how right it felt to touch her. "I've been thinking," he said carefully. "The Broken Arrow's doing well. Josiah's talking about expanding the operation next year, maybe bringing in more cattle, building additional structures. He's hinted that he wants to make me foreman eventually, which would mean better pay and a small house of my own on the property instead of the bunkhouse." Zara turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity." "It is," Buck agreed. "But that house, it would be too big for just one person. It needs a family to fill it." He watched her expression shift from curiosity to understanding to cautious hope. "Buck, "What are you asking?" He slid off his chair and knelt in front of her, still holding her hand. "I'm asking if you'd marry me, Zara. I know we've only been courting for a few months, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life. You're what I've been looking for all these years of drifting. You're home. And I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you finally have that place to belong that you dreamed of." Tears spilled down Zara's cheeks, but she was smiling. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Buck stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the love and promise he felt. Around them, several boarders who'd been watching from windows whooped and hollered their congratulations, and Mrs. Chen came out onto the porch with a rare smile on her face. "About time," the older woman said. "I was beginning to think you'd never get around to asking." They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Ash Fork. Mrs. Chen stood up for Zara, and Pete, one of the other Broken Arrow cowboys, stood up for Buck. Josiah attended, as did several of the boarding house regulars who'd grown fond of Zara. It wasn't a large wedding, but it was filled with genuine happiness and goodwill. Zara wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, and she carried wildflowers that Buck had ridden out at dawn to pick. When she walked toward him in that little church, Buck felt his throat tighten with emotion. This woman who'd had nothing, who'd been sleeping alone under the stars with only a thin blanket and broken dreams, was choosing to trust him with her future. "I promise you'll never sleep without shelter again," Buck whispered to her during the ceremony, his voice rough with feeling. "I promise you'll always have a home and you'll always have me." "That's all I've ever wanted," Zara whispered back. "Someone who stays." They moved into the foreman's house at the Broken Arrow 2 weeks later, after Buck officially accepted the promotion Josiah offered. The house was small but sturdy, with 2 bedrooms, a good kitchen, and a porch that looked out over the valley. Zara transformed it into a home with curtains she sewed, furniture they bought in Flagstaff, and small touches that made it uniquely theirs. She also quickly became an invaluable part of the ranch operation in her own right. The bunkhouse cowboys had been cooking for themselves with predictably terrible results, so Zara offered to provide meals for the crew. Her cooking was so good that morale improved noticeably, and Josiah insisted on paying her for the work. She also helped with the ranch accounts, having a natural head for numbers that made keeping the books much easier. Buck had never imagined domestic life could make him this content. Coming home after a long day of work to find Zara waiting, sharing meals together, falling asleep with her in his arms every night. It was everything he'd never known he needed. They talked about everything, laughed often, and built a partnership that was as much about friendship and respect as it was about love. That winter was hard, with heavy snows that made keeping the cattle fed a constant challenge. Buck worked brutal hours, often coming home exhausted and half frozen. But Zara was always there with hot food, warm blankets, and the kind of steady support that made even the hardest days bearable. She'd rub his sore shoulders, listen to his concerns about the stock, and remind him that they were building something together that would last. Spring came with the promise of new life. The cattle that survived the winter were healthy, and several of the cows dropped calves that thrived in the warming weather. Josiah was pleased with how well the operation had weathered the difficult months, and he gave Buck and the crew bonuses that reflected his appreciation. It was during that spring, as wildflowers covered the valley and the aspens leafed out in brilliant green, that Zara told Buck she was pregnant. They were sitting on their porch watching the sunset, and she'd been quieter than usual all evening. Finally, she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said softly, watching his face carefully. Come late fall, probably November. Buck felt like all the air had been knocked out of his lungs. A baby, his baby, their baby. A child who would grow up knowing nothing but love and security, who would never have to dream of belonging because belonging would be their birthright. "Zara," he breathed, pulling her into his arms carefully, like she was suddenly made of glass. "That's the best news you could have given me." "Are you happy? Are you scared? What do you need?" she laughed, the sound full of joy and relief. "I'm all of those things. Happy, scared, excited, terrified, but mostly happy. I never thought I'd have this, Buck. A husband who loves me, a home of my own, and now a baby. It's more than I ever dreamed of." "You deserve it all," Buck said fiercely, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You deserve everything good this world has to offer, and I'm going to spend my life making sure you get it." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through summer and into fall. Zara continued cooking for the crew until she got too big to stand for long periods, at which point Buck took over despite his terrible cooking skills. The cowboys ate his attempts without complaint, though everyone breathed a sigh of relief when Zara was able to return to the kitchen in a more supervisory capacity. Josiah was delighted about the baby, treating the news as if he were becoming a grandfather. He'd never had children of his own, his wife having died young after several miscarriages, and he'd resigned himself to the ranch, passing to strangers when he died. But over the past year, Buck and Zara had become like family to him, and the knowledge that a new generation was coming gave him renewed purpose. "I've been thinking about the future," Josiah said one evening when he'd invited Buck and Zara to dinner at the main house. "I'm not getting any younger, and this operation needs someone to take it forward after I'm gone. Buck, you've proved yourself 10 times over. You know this ranch as well as I do now, maybe better in some ways. And Zara, you've become essential to keeping things running smoothly. So I want to propose something." He pulled out a document covered in legal language. "I've had papers drawn up making you 2 partners in the Broken Arrow. 20% ownership now, with the understanding that when I pass, you'll inherit the rest. I've got no one else to leave it to, and I can't think of anyone I'd rather see carry on what I've built." Buck stared at the papers, unable to speak. Zara's hand found his under the table and squeezed tight. This was beyond anything they'd imagined, not just employment but ownership. A legacy they could pass to their children and grandchildren. "Josiah, that's too generous," Buck finally managed. "We can't accept something like that without giving you something in return." "You've already given me plenty," the older man said gruffly. "You've given me purpose again, someone to teach and pass on knowledge to. You've made this place feel less lonely. That's worth more than you know, so say yes and let's make this official." "Yes," Zara said, her voice strong. She looked at Buck. "We say yes." Buck nodded, emotion thick in his throat. "Yes, sir, and thank you. You've given us more than just a ranch. You've given us a future." They signed the papers that night, and suddenly Buck and Zara weren't just employees but part owners of one of the best ranches in northern Arizona territory. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity. Everything Buck had worked for, everything Zara had dreamed of, was coming together in ways neither of them could have imagined when they'd met under the stars nearly a year ago. The baby came on a cold November night during an early snowstorm. The doctor from Flagstaff had been staying at the ranch for the past week, waiting for Zara to go into labor, which turned out to be fortunate because the storm made the roads impassable. Buck paced the kitchen while Zara labored in their bedroom, Mrs. Chen having come up from Ash Fork specifically to help with the birth. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Buck had faced charging cattle, violent men, and life-threatening storms without flinching, but hearing Zara's cries of pain nearly undid him. Josiah sat with him, offering quiet support and occasionally forcing coffee into his hands. Finally, in the early hours of morning as the storm began to clear, a baby's cry pierced the air. Buck was on his feet instantly, but Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway before he could rush past her. "You have a son," she said with a smile. "A healthy, loud son, and Zara is fine, just tired. Give us a few minutes to clean things up, then you can come in." A son. Buck sank into his chair, overwhelmed. When Mrs. Chen finally gestured him forward, he entered the bedroom on shaky legs. Zara lay propped against pillows, exhausted but glowing, a tiny bundle in her arms. She looked up as he approached, and the love in her eyes took his breath away. "Meet your son," she said softly, adjusting the blanket so Buck could see the baby's face. He was red and wrinkled and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. Buck reached out with one finger to touch the baby's cheek, marveling at the softness. "He's beautiful," he whispered, "just like his mother." "We need to name him," Zara said. "I was thinking maybe Benjamin. We could call him Ben." "Benjamin Lawson," Buck said, testing the sound. "I like it." "Benjamin it is." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and Zara placed the baby in his arms. Buck held his son for the first time, this tiny perfect person who depended on them for everything, and felt something fundamental shift in his heart. This was what mattered. This was what life was about. Not drifting, not just surviving, but building something real with people you loved. "Thank you," he said to Zara, his voice rough. "Thank you for trusting me, for choosing me, for giving me this. I promise I'll never take it for granted." "I know," Zara said, reaching up to touch his face. "You're a good man, Buck Lawson. The best man I've ever known. And you're going to be a wonderful father." Ben grew strong and healthy through that winter, bringing laughter and light to the ranch even during the darkest, coldest days. The Cowboys adored him, and Josiah became the doting grandfather figure the baby would never have had otherwise. Zara recovered her strength quickly, and by spring, she was back to managing the household and helping with the ranch accounts, though now she did much of it with Ben sleeping in a basket near her feet. Life settled into a new rhythm, one that included midnight feedings and crying that interrupted sleep, but also first smiles and the profound joy of watching a child discover the world. Buck had never imagined himself as a father, but he took to it with the same dedication he brought to everything else. He'd work all day on the ranch, then come home to take over baby duty so Zara could rest. He'd walk Ben around the house, telling him stories about the cattle and the land, about his mother's courage and strength, about how much they both loved him. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered under their combined management. They added more cattle, improved the breeding stock, and built additional outbuildings. Buck's reputation as a fair and knowledgeable rancher grew, and the Broken Arrow became known as one of the best operations in the territory. Ben grew into a sturdy toddler, then a bright-eyed boy who followed his father around the ranch on chubby legs, wanting to help with everything. 2 years after Ben was born, Zara gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, who had her mother's amber eyes and her father's stubborn determination. 3 years after Rose came another son, Daniel, quiet and thoughtful even as an infant. Josiah lived to see all 3 grandchildren, as he called them, growing healthier and more content in his final years than he'd been in decades. He taught Ben to ride, told Rose stories about the old days, and held baby Daniel with the careful tenderness of someone who knew how precious such moments were. When Josiah passed peacefully in his sleep one spring morning, having just turned 73, the grief was profound but not bitter. He'd lived to see the ranch he'd built continue into a new generation, had been surrounded by family even if it wasn't by blood, and had died knowing his legacy was secure. Buck and Zara inherited full ownership of the Broken Arrow as planned. The responsibility was enormous, but they'd been preparing for it for years. They ran the ranch together, making decisions as partners, teaching their children the value of hard work and respect for the land and animals. The children grew, and so did the ranch. Ben developed into a talented horseman and cattleman, clearly destined to take over the operation someday. Rose surprised everyone by showing a remarkable head for business, helping her mother with the accounts and suggesting improvements that increased profits. Daniel proved to have a gift with animals, able to gentle even the wildest horse with patience and quiet persistence. Buck and Zara's love deepened over the years, weathering the storms that all marriages face, but emerging stronger each time. They'd built exactly what Zara had dreamed of that night when Buck found her sleeping under the stars, a place where she belonged absolutely and completely. A home filled with love, children, purpose, and security. Sometimes, on clear nights, Buck and Zara would sit on their porch after the children were asleep, looking up at the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting. Zara would rest her head on Buck's shoulder, and he'd wrap his arm around her, and they'd marvel at how far they'd come from those early days. "You remember what you said to me that morning?" Zara asked one such night, years later when their children were grown and starting families of their own. "When you first found me sleeping out there, I asked if you had somewhere to go," Buck said, "and you said you didn't have people or a place. You said you dreamed of belonging somewhere." "I found it," Zara said softly. "Everything I dreamed of and more. I found home. I found family. I found love. I found you." Buck kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "We found each other," he corrected gently, "and we built this together." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, the same stars that had watched over a lonely young woman with nothing but dreams and a cowboy who didn't yet know he was looking for home. The ranch was quiet around them, the cattle settled for the night, the horses dozing in the barn, their grandchildren sleeping peacefully in the house. The Arizona Territory had become Arizona State. The wild frontier days had settled into something more civilized. The railroad had brought more people, more towns, more change than anyone could have imagined back in 1878. But through all those changes, the Broken Arrow had endured and thrived, passing from Josiah to Buck and Zara, and now beginning to pass to their children. Ben had married a teacher from Flagstaff, a smart woman named Clara who fit into the ranch family seamlessly. They had 2 children of their own, with another on the way. Rose had surprised them all by marrying a lawyer and moving to Phoenix, but she and her husband visited often, and she still helped manage the ranch's business affairs from a distance. Daniel had stayed on the ranch, working alongside his father, and recently started courting a neighboring rancher's daughter. "We did good, didn't we?" Buck said, his voice reflective. "Took a lot of broken pieces and built something whole." "We did better than good," Zara replied. "We created a legacy. Not just this ranch, but a family that knows how to love, how to work hard, how to treat people with dignity and respect. That's worth more than all the cattle and land put together." "Speaking of legacy," Buck said with a smile in his voice, "Ben told me this morning that he and Clara are expecting twins. Apparently it runs in her family." Zara sat up straight, her face breaking into a delighted smile. "Twins, oh Buck, that's wonderful news. This place is going to be filled with children again." "Just like it should be," Buck agreed. He pulled her close again, feeling grateful for every moment, every memory, every challenge they'd faced together. "You know what I think about sometimes? That night I almost didn't leave Ash Fork. If I'd stayed in that saloon for one more drink, if I'd ridden a different direction, if I'd made camp somewhere else, I might never have found you. But you did find me, Zara said firmly. And I found you. And everything else followed from that. Some things are just meant to be, Buck. We were meant to find each other, meant to build this life together. I believe that with everything in me. So do I, Buck said. So do I. As the night deepened, and the stars grew brighter, they eventually went inside to their bedroom, the same room where all three of their children had been born, the same room where they'd shared thousands of nights over the decades. They climbed into bed together, fitting against each other with the ease of long practice, and Buck wrapped his arms around Zara just as he had every night since they married. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "Today, tomorrow, and every day after that." "I love you too," Zara whispered back. "Thank you for giving me a home." "Thank you for being my home," Buck replied. They drifted off to sleep together, under the same roof that had sheltered them through all the seasons of their life together, on the same land that had witnessed their love story unfold from that chance meeting under the stars to this peaceful moment decades later. The story that had begun with a lonely cowboy discovering a young woman sleeping in the desert with nothing but dreams had become a tale of love, family, legacy, and the profound truth that home isn't a place, but the people who choose to build a life together. Buck and Zara had both been searching for somewhere to belong, and in finding each other, they discovered that belonging wasn't something you found, but something you created through love, commitment, and the daily choice to stay and build something lasting. Their children would tell the story to their children, and those children would tell it to the next generation, about how Grandpa Buck found Grandma Zara sleeping under the stars, and how she'd said she dreamed of a place to belong, and how together they'd built that place into something more beautiful and enduring than either of them could have imagined. The Broken Arrow Ranch would continue long after Buck and Zara were gone, a testament to what two people who started with nothing but love and determination could accomplish. The land would pass to new hands, but the foundation they'd built, the values they'd instilled, the love they'd shared would echo through generations. And sometimes, on clear nights when the stars were especially bright, their descendants would look up at the vast Arizona sky and remember the story of how it all began, with a dream of belonging and a chance meeting that changed everything. They'd remember that sometimes the most important journeys aren't about traveling far, but about finding the courage to stay, to commit, to build something real with someone brave enough to dream alongside you. Buck and Zara had both been wanderers in their own ways, searching for something they couldn't quite name. But in finding each other, they discovered that what they'd been searching for all along was simply each other. And from that discovery, they'd built a life filled with love, purpose, family, and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. Their story was one of hope, proving that no matter how lost you feel, no matter how uncertain your future seems, the right person at the right moment can change everything. It was a reminder that kindness matters, that taking a chance on someone can lead to unexpected blessings, and that the best homes are built not of wood and stone but of love, trust, and shared dreams. As the years continued to pass and Buck and Zara grew old together, never once did they regret the choices they'd made. They'd started with nothing but ended with everything that truly mattered. They'd found their place to belong, not in a location but in each other, and they'd built that belonging into something that would outlast them both. And when, many years later, they finally passed from this world, it was together, holding hands in the same bed where they'd shared so many nights, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who knew without question that they were deeply loved. Their final words to each other were the same ones they'd spoken countless times throughout their life together. "Thank you for being my home," Zara whispered. "Thank you for being mine," Buck whispered back. And then they closed their eyes and drifted off together one last time. Their journey in this world complete, but their legacy continuing on in the family they'd created, and the land they'd nurtured, and the love story they'd lived so fully and completely. The Broken Arrow Ranch stood as their monument, not to wealth or power, but to something far more valuable: the enduring power of love, the importance of family, and the profound truth that sometimes the greatest adventures aren't about traveling the world, but about finding one person worth staying still for, worth building a life with, worth calling home. Their story, which began with a cowboy discovering a woman sleeping under the stars and her simple declaration that she dreamed of a place to belong, had become exactly what dreams are meant to become when they're nurtured with love and dedication. A beautiful, lasting reality that blessed not just 2 lives but generations to come.